Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Eric Ferrero. I'm the Executive Director at the Fund for Investigative Journalism. We provide grants and other support directly to journalists to do groundbreaking investigative stories that have an impact. And we also provide resources and information for the broader field of journalists and journalism students around the country through seminars like the one you've joined us for today. I'm so thrilled to be able to introduce to you the two speakers today who are going to be presenting a seminar called Unsung Records, which is on how to bring stories to life with often overlooked records and information. You're going to be hearing from Jim Steele, who is a man who often needs no introduction, frankly, a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, former reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, former editor-at-large for Time magazine, and many other affiliations, and the author of several books, widely regarded as one of the best investigative journalists in the country, and a new member of the board of directors at the Fund for Investigative Journalism. We're also joined today by the vice president of the Fund for Investigative Journalism, Anu Narayanswamy, a data reporter at the Washington Post and a real leader in the field as well. They're going to both walk through today's seminar, and we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end. As you have questions, you can just ask them in the chat, and Anu will be fishing questions out of there a little bit later in the hour to get to them. The other thing is we'll be sending out to everybody who registered for today's session will receive by the end of the day tomorrow a recording of this session, as well as a tip sheet and the slides that Jim and Anu use in the presentation. And you can also go to our website, fij.org, under the resources section to view past webinars and seminars featuring leaders in the field and grantees of ours. So without further ado, let me turn over to Jim Steele with great thanks for presenting this today.
Thank you so much, Eric, and everyone out there, good day. Great to be with everyone. I love to talk about documents and records, so I feel very much at home, anybody who signed up for this. In my time as a reporter, there have really been two momentous developments in our craft, and this has to do with really documents and data. Now, there's always been a little of that, but there's been a veritable explosion of interest and use in this period, in these two things in the time I've been a journalist. Don't misunderstand me. This doesn't in any way diminish the power and the importance of interviews. Interviews are crucial, always have been, and still are. But what documents and data do, they supplement that. They bolster that case. And I think when you look at the kind of journalism we are producing in this country, and certainly the long form journalism, you can see that documents and data have made our field much more scientific. And I mean scientific in the best of all sense of the word. In other words, not just relying on anecdotal information, but bolstering it with some substantial trends that show us all what's been happening. Most of my career has been spent dealing with documents, but I'll tell you, I didn't start that way. I started as a young reporter in Kansas City at the Star as I was working my way through college. And frankly, when you wanted to find out something, you were supposed to reach for the phone, call somebody, call an expert, somebody who maybe knows about that. The fact that there was another way of getting that information was something nobody told me, that I was totally unaware of. It wasn't until I really got to Philadelphia in the early 1970s that I realized that there was this great, incredible world of records and documents that can open the door to stories that you otherwise would not be able to get. I'll tell you just a little bit about what that first experience was. I was an urban affairs writer, and one of the things I was covering was housing. And I picked up some tips that a program founded by the federal government to encourage home ownership among low-income people was foundering. Somehow the people were being kicked out of their houses. Well, what was this about? Could they without money? Did something go wrong with the process? Was the government treating them harshly? I didn't know. But I talked it over with another young reporter who had joined the Inquirer at that time, a fellow by the name of Don Bartlett. And Don said, well, why don't we just take a look at some property records of the city? So we trundled down to Philadelphia's big city, Old City Hall, and began looking at the deed and mortgage books. Back in those days, it's hard for me to realize this is the way things were done then. But the index for deeds and mortgages was all done by hand in ink on ledger books that were basically 3 by 3. If you can imagine this, think of a scriptorium like in Parma, Italy in 1305. I mean, that's what these things look like. People would methodically and slowly enter them by hand. Well, anyway, we looked under the heading for the Department of Housing and Urban Development out of curiosity, because that was the overseer of FHA, the housing programs, page after page after page of entries. We went back a few years before that, only a handful of entries. We then began pulling some of the actual documents themselves, indicating that HUD, the FHA overseer, was taking title to a lot of these foreclosed properties. We didn't know what was going on. We just know there was a tremendous amount of activity. We pulled more of them, and the same mortgage company kept coming up 90% of the time. The same names of real estate companies kept coming up, a very small number of them. Obviously, there were patterns there right away that we could see within a day or two looking at those ledgers. We didn't know what it meant, but we proposed that as a series. Now, from that, we began to see the patterns of where speculators would buy a house, put a coat of paint on it. They'd buy it for like $1,000, put a coat of paint on it, sell it for $8,000 or $9,000 later, maybe $12,000. The mortgage was insured by a company that had no risk involved because the Federal Housing Administration said if anything happens, we will pick up the mortgage, we'll make you whole. So you had this cycle. And what we began seeing was that these houses would immediately fall apart because they weren't properly renovated. And in some cases, the same speculators would come in, buy the house over again, put another coat of paint on it, go to the same mortgage company, insure the house, and the house again would collapse. And the person who thought they were getting a home, buying a home for the first time in their life, found themselves dispossessed. Anyway, this led to, we had incredible human stories out of this, needless to say, because the documents, in addition to showing this pattern, gave us the names of people to interview. And that's another thing to always remember about documents. They're a great avenue into finding people. We had some unbelievably powerful human stories of people who had lost their homes. No doubt about that. But what made this a different kind of story was the whole arc of the story. The beginning of it with the speculators, the mortgage companies coming in, the federal agencies approving these processes, and then the whole thing falling down. So it showed to us the great power of documents. It wasn't just a case of one bad apple, a speculator here or there. This was a case of a whole barrel of bad apples, and with a system that had become terribly corrupt. I mean, after that, needless to say, I was a complete and total believer in the power of documents to tell stories. But here's the thing that's interesting. When I think back to that time, there were still a lot of people who were very skeptical of that. People would come up to Don and me and say, well, this is all well and good. This is an interesting story. But the fact of the matter is, people don't write down the really good stuff. They don't write down the really bad things. They keep that to themselves. Well, I'll tell you over and over again, this has been disproven to me. I can't begin to tell you the number. We could spend hours giving examples. I won't do that, don't worry. But I'll give you one here as an example. Don and I began examining a tax reform act a number of years ago that purported to clean up the tax code, to eliminate loopholes, and to make this whole system fairer for everyone. Well, Don and I began to read the actual act itself. Those people who think investigative reporting is full of these dramatic events where you hide behind pillars and people slip you documents. Well, the heart of the matter is reading, systematic reading of very, very often boring documents. Well, and by the way, I got to tell you this. If any of you have any trouble sleeping, have I got something for you? Just download a few pages of the latest tax law, start reading. I'm telling you, in 10 minutes, you are out. And think about it. This thing is great, non-toxic, it's free, always works. Anyway, we began reading this tax code, and in it, we started running across some interesting things. One night when I was almost asleep, I came across this following paragraph that I think Anna is going to show us on the screen there. That's our number 2 illustration. Yes, here it is. After a section which this act repealed a bunch of terrible tax shelters down in the Caribbean. This is in the law, by the way. At the bottom of that section, which was doing all the right things, is this particular paragraph. And if you read this, believe it or not, is actually in the law. This is a special tax break that applies, it turns out, to one person. And the lawmakers, in all of their chest beating about all the good they were doing, plugged this thing in as well to nullify many of the effects of the reforms they were putting in place down in the Caribbean. We can go back to our dialogue now. Anwar, thank you so much. Donna kept reading the act, and over again, we found one after another of these kinds of exceptions. Sometimes they were called transition rules, exceptions, where in the midst of this act that was supposedly doing all the right things, there were literally hundreds of these things that exempted folks who had access to the halls of Congress from paying the taxes on that particular thing. On that particular one, I just give you a thumbnail sketch of it, just so you know what that was. This turned out to be a California real estate developer, a member of this state's horse racing commission of all things. And maybe most pointedly, when we ran his name, he had been a White House dinner guest about 6 months before that wonderful clause found its way into the law. So it all got down to who had access. And if you had the money and you had the access, you knew a congressman, you could very often get your custom-made tax break. We actually got as much mail from really rich people on that series because they were all mad because they didn't get one as well. But anyway, it proved to me over and over again that despite the people who say nothing is written down, over and over again, you will find a lot of really amazing things written down. One of the things we also found, in addition to things that were loaded there, is that as we began going through records and seeing the great potential, the great possibility that they would have for almost every story, another thing was also very apparent, and I want to really stress this. While we often had the luxury of working weeks and months, in some cases a year on a story, and it was a tremendous luxury and a wonderful thing to be able to do. Records and documents are not just for these gigantic projects, and that's the point I want to make. They can apply just as well to much more shorter range projects. The key is to think about how you might put them to use. I think Anu is going to put up on the screen our third example. Before in the suburbs of Philadelphia, some time back, there was a wonderful piece of land that was being bought by one individual who wanted to carve it up into 5-acre lots. It was, I think, 25, 30 acres. And a young reporter on the paper went out and did a story about the neighbors, the controversy, and what might happen to this land. And just a regular kind of feature story that we all do everywhere in the country at many times. Well, in the midst of this story was the paragraph here. And if you can take a moment to just kind of quickly read it, you'll have it later. The heart of all great writing, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, is really detail, not superfluous detail, but detail that advances the story, that sort of enlightens you, that gives you a feel for what's being written about. And this is about as compact and wonderful a paragraph of detail and rich things that you'll ever find. Excuse me, if you've all had a chance to read, one of us went over to the reporter who had written this, and it's a great story. I can't remember who did this at the time. And we were fascinated, like, where in the world did you get that information? And was it in the clips in the library? Was it somebody who'd been at the place for 70 years? Well, I'll tell you what this enterprising young reporter did. When you're wealthy, usually you have to file an estate in probate court or family court. It's called different things in different states. And usually as part of inheritance taxes, both state in some cases federal, you have to have an inventory of assets. So what this young reporter did, he simply went to the county courthouse, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. He knew the names of 3 or 4 of these previous owners, pulled their estates, and pulled out some of that wonderful detail, including that business about the overstuffed fish and things over the bar. Anyway, there's no way such wonderful detail could ever have been acquired any other way, to my knowledge. Anybody who went back that far, that property was by then dead. So that's the point I'm trying to make here. These documents and records, we think of them with big projects, but it's not just the big projects. They help really, really all reporting in that sense. Even so, despite how much documents and data have taken a hold in journalism, I still find there's a lot of reluctance among a lot of journalists to think about using documents. They're not sure where to start. They think they don't know anything about the process. They have misapprehensions. They think somebody like me or Don or somebody else in our business who's been working with documents for years knows where everything is. They think I have some big manual on my study. You can see it behind me here, some big fat catalog I can open up and show, well, I'm looking at this, I'll find it there. Well, I'm still looking for that manual. It doesn't exist, of course. So how do you know where to look? Because one of the most important things about documents is that most of them you use once, maybe twice. You have to think about what's needed for that particular story. And so what Don and I adopted many years ago was the concept, what I call a document state of mind. You assume something is out there until you're proven wrong. And again, if we had several hours here today, don't panic. I'm not going to do that to you. I could tell you any number of examples of where the document state of mind works. And anybody wants to email me afterward, I'll be happy to even discuss that further. But over and over again, this has been the case. You think of where it is, where it might be, you start asking questions, you start thinking of what it might be. Just like that young reporter who got that beautiful paragraph that we just saw. He got to thinking, where would I find information about all of these people in this land? And that's what he did. Another misconception, in addition to people thinking that those of us who work in documents know where everything is, a lot of people who start in this, they kind of think they're looking for what I would call a blockbuster document. Something where you can just see the TV, the camera is zeroing right in, and right there, it's just clear as a bell. Somebody's been nailed, and wow, look at that. Well, they almost never happen. The heart of using documents, think of it as a jigsaw puzzle. There's one piece here, there's a piece there, and all of them add together to present you with a picture of what this particular issue is all about. Every one of those pieces is pretty important. Some might be a little more important than others, but all of them are really necessary to see exactly what's going on there. I'll give you an example of a kind of a classic story that Don and I did a few years back for Vanity Fair that illustrates exactly this jigsaw pattern. At the outset of the Iraqi war, the US airlifted billions of dollars to Iraq in US dollars, basically walking around money for Iraqis as the country was collapsing. But it was also to make sure that the US cemented its presence there. Airlifted this money. It was like it was $12-13 billion over time. There was been kind of a kerfuffle when this happened, and people wondered what happened to all the money and blah, blah, blah. And then it went away. Well, Don and I decided, let's look at this and just kind of trace this and see what we can find. When we start any story, the first thing we do is we try to read. We see what the documents are, what's around on this. In this particular case, it was a congressional hearing that was not covered very well. It got into some of the details of this, all kinds of addendums that showed where the money came out of. It came out of a giant warehouse in the Meadowlands in New Jersey, outside of New York. In this congressional hearing, there were names of people who were civilians working for the US government in Iraq who saw some of this money when it arrived. So that gave us some names of people to look up. There was also the name of a company that was hired by the Pentagon to look after this money. We got that name from the congressional report. That also led to us getting records out of California, and it turned out San Diego County. But anyway, and the last thing, which was part of this, is that we filed an FOI request. And let me tell you just a little bit about FOIs, for Freedom of Information requests. You will hear people swear by them. You will hear people curse about them because they fall into the category, you never know what will happen. You may file an FOI request and the agency may stonewall you and turn you away and not answer you. You can even threaten them to put them in jail, which supposedly the law allows the press to do in a way. I'm just joking about that. But you never know what will happen. But I always encourage people to file it. It's one piece of paper. There's all kinds of forms online. The Freedom of Information Center has these, IRE has them. They're very common things that tell you how to do this and what's to cite and so forth. Well, in this case, we did file an FOI request pertaining to the contract that hired this company to look after the money. And here is an excerpt from this FOI. As you notice, there's a little bit of redaction going on there, like the name of the president of the company, the address of the company, or the physical address of the company. If you look at the phone number over there on the left, 858-274, it wasn't too hard to find out from that. Well, that's San Diego County. And 274 is an exchange in La Jolla, that very upscale suburb of San Diego County. So this led us to California corporate records for this company above there, North Star Consultants. It also led us to local records to see if there was any litigation, any property ownership, things of that sort. All of those things led us to at least find out where this was, and then to attempt to interview the person who was head of that company, who actually declined to interview. But the most interesting aspect of what I'm showing you there is that they redacted like his name, they redacted the physical address, the full phone number in San Diego County, but look what they left exposed. North Star Consultants, post office box, what is it, 3813, I guess it is, Nassau, the Bahamas. That's a strange place for a defense contractor to have his address, his mailing address, isn't it? Anyway, by the way, this is somebody obviously had to go to the Bahamas to get to the bottom of this. I heroically volunteered for that job. And it turned out there were quite a bit of records there on this company as well. But the point I want to make about this is we, just as a lark, ran that number, that post office box number on Google and a couple of other search engines. And up popped a document from a bankruptcy court in Florida. And to make a long story short, the document showed that that particular post office box was the locus of this giant offshore tax fraud. So here we have a government contractor operating out of a post office box in the Bahamas that's the center of a multi-million-dollar offshore tax fraud. And it turned out when we tried to trace the money, this company was never, as far as we were able to tell, to determine what happened to any of that money, the 12 or $13 billion. So that's why I say FOI requests, you never know what you're going to get. You never know what they're going to try to knock out of it, but file it as well, because you never know what will happen. I'm going to try to cut a couple of this a little bit short because we're getting close to the half-hour mark and we want to leave plenty of time for questions from all of you. One of the things that Eric sent out last night was a prologue from the book Don and I wrote many years ago on Howard Hughes, the famed aviator, movie producer, industrialist, secretive dude of the highest order in that sense. And the reason we sent this out is that Don and I wrote this book many years ago, and basically nobody close to Hughes would talk to us. And the reason for that, because many of them were under a criminal investigation because of the way he had died. Here he had a 6'3" man who weighed 94 pounds at his death. And on top of that, x-rays revealed broken off needles in one arm that had apparently happened as he was getting injections of various drugs. So nobody would really talk. But it turned out, because he did not leave a will, vast amounts of documents, court records, searches by court officers flowed into the public domain in court cases all over America. And it was from those that we were able to largely assemble the book. We were fortunate to get some interviews early in his career, but in the latter part, we were very dependent on these documents. Well, anyway, what the prologue that Eric sent out shows, it recounts Hughes's last days in a hotel in Acapulco, his physical condition, his complaints, the irritation of those around him over the way he was bugging them about various things, the fact he was clearly dying, but nobody was getting medical help, and the ultimate decision finally to put him on a plane and take him to a hospital in the US. Anyway, this is all documented step by step as though you were there. And it's like 99% done from public records, not interviews. So records, in addition to everything else, giving you color, things you can't get elsewhere, can also provide the narrative flow of many things. I'm just quickly going to talk about some basic documents. Well, I made the point earlier that many documents you use once and you never use again. It is also true that there are some basic documents out there that you do continue to use over and over again. The ones I mentioned from FAA, property records, all reporters should familiarize themselves with that. Deeds, mortgages, appraisal records, things of that sort. Some of the other documents you should obviously be familiar with are state and corporation records. These vary from state to state, what they cover and who they list. But that's also extremely important. Court records, to me, remain in some ways the single largest repository of information for reporters, both civil and criminal, especially civil, and not the boilerplate that you see with civil lawsuits, but the depositions, the declarations, the affidavits, the specific things like that that are from people involved in a particular action. The depositions in the Hughes case were absolutely crucial to us telling that whole story. Huge mammoth things that took forever to read, but that's part of the process. Also, bankruptcy court. One of the most overlooked parts in the court system are bankruptcy court. I can't tell you over the years the number of leads that bankruptcy courts have provided us. That's where we found so many names in our series and later book on America, What Went Wrong. Some of the most powerful portraits of people who lost their health insurance and faced other dire situations came from claims filed in bankruptcy court. Similarly, at the federal level, the Government Accountability Office and Inspector General's offices in each agency, you will find reports. We'll talk a little bit later about IRS and some statistics of income when I get into dealing with some numbers. There are specific think tanks that deal with particular issues like health. I think of the Kaiser Family Foundation. It's done an incredible job of pulling together a lot of data in the whole issue of healthcare, FDA. Also, the government agencies, whether it's transportation, housing, justice. So many of the most important things that happen in Washington happen in these agencies, not on Capitol Hill. And it's one of the least covered aspects of the whole federal system. And I don't care where you are, whether you're in Washington or Yuma, Arizona, because of the internet now, you have access to all of that in a way that you didn't a few years ago. When any agency proposes any big change, all that's on the docket that's accessible to you. You can see who is complaining if the FDA wants to do this, who doesn't want that to happen, who does want that to happen. All of that's online now. It wasn't so many years ago, you had to go to Washington to look at that stuff. It's part of what I kind of call the golden era of reporting, because we can do a lot of these things now that used to be much, much more difficult. And lastly, well, actually two lastly things here, sorry. Lastly, the Statistical Abstract is an amazing document. For years, it was just a fat book like about this size. Now it's online, but the value it has everything in it: housing, economic stuff, tax data, education, crime, population, you name it. It's not, you don't necessarily want to pull that out right itself, but it becomes a lead-in to tell you the name of the report where a lot of that information is found. And the great thing about it is it's just one fat volume. totally overlooked by journalists at all times. But it's one thing in the old days when everything was paper, it was on our desk when we wanted to look at anything. And lastly, one last thing I'll tell you before we get into some Q&A, and Anu and I talk about some numbers. Always try to read the fine print of anything you're looking at. I've never forgotten Mike Graybill of ProPublica, the lead writer on an amazing series sometime back on temporary workers. And by reading the fine print, he came across this incredible reference to a video in a bottling plant that essentially was when some worker who was there on his first day and had no training was basically crushed at it. It was a supplement to the written story. But in this day and age, when we want everything, video, audio, text, it was a remarkable piece of work that he would have missed had he not been reading the footnotes of I believe it was a federal report on ocean violations. Anyway, enough of me going on about this, but Anu and I want to talk a little bit about numbers. And the only thing I want to, because numbers are so pivotal and so important to stories nowadays. And what I really want to stress, I was an English major. Anybody's out there that wants to talk about Faulkner? Well, we'll talk about Faulkner later. Anyway, my point being, I had no significant mathematical training, but most of the math you need as a journalist does not involve calculus. It's pretty simple math, and we'll show you a couple here in a minute or two. But Anu, did you have anything you want to add to that at this point? We talked about this earlier.
So we've talked a lot about using documents to tell stories, and I'm a data reporter. I use data numbers to make these stories more robust. And one of the things I have noticed is many of your stories, and even in the books and whatever else you're collecting, there is a lot of data in these documents which can be translated into stories and how you use them. So could you talk a little bit about how you have gone about gathering this data? And I can talk a little bit about the tools. I am a self-trained coder, if you will. I was also an English major. I did not do a computer science course or anything. But when I started doing investigative stories, I quickly realized that there is a lot of material which we are unable to get to with just reading documents, especially in today when there is so much available online. Right. Working with spreadsheets is something which many journalists have those skills and should be developing those skills to be able to get to the finer details which really make the story really robust. So Jim, can you talk about what you have worked over the years using data to tell stories with a few examples of, how these data really came to life with those numbers?
Don and I actually first started using, with the help of Phil Meyer, who was a great guru of data journalism back in the 70s, analyzing criminal court cases back in Philadelphia. It was our first real entree to this. But now, of course, we can all do this on our notebook computers because of what's capable. Back in those days, you had to have a massive computer entity. But I'll just give you one example. Last year, Don and I updated our book from the 90s on what was happening economically, the American middle class, a book called America, What Went Wrong. And in the course of this, looked at the Trump tax bill from 2017. There were many, many stories at the time indicating that basically it favored the rich or the well-off and did not favor middle-class folks so well. But these, for the most part, were generalities. So for the book, we actually took a look at, what kinds of numbers are we talking about? And this is an example that would apply to anybody. If you could put up that number 5 from the Joint Committee, it's a page from there. There we go. This would be an example of how we work with numbers. The Joint Committee on Taxation is a nonpartisan entity in Congress that's been around for almost 100 years. It's widely respected for the most part on both sides of the aisle, or has been over the years anyway. They analyzed the Trump tax bill as to change who would benefit, who would get this, that, the other thing. Well, here are the raw numbers. And if you look down at the very bottom there, 1 million and over, that shows the total amount in dollars there at the bottom, the 858 billion. And then they over here on this side, 572,000 taxpayers. So nowhere in this report does it tell you exactly what this is in terms of maybe an individual taxpayer. But if you extrapolate with just simple math, you can see what that turns out to be. And if you can we see that Excel spreadsheet?
Sorry, that took a while.
There, that's okay. That's all right. There it is. But just simply by taking those numbers into the taxpayers, you see what the average tax cut was. Believe me, I think it's a lot more powerful to people, readers, viewers, listeners, if they hear everybody in that million or more categories receiving on average a tax cut of $64,000 a year for 10 years. Now, we did the same thing for the middle class, people in that 50 to 75,000 range. They were getting roughly $800 a year for 10 years. I mean, it has a way of giving more bulk and substance rather than the glittering generality of saying upper income people did better than other people. It really puts a face on it. But anyway, but the reason I bring this up is not to talk about that. I'm bringing this up because it shows you most of the math that you can do is really pretty simple math. It's not that complicated. And one of the great things now is when we did the first book years ago, we had to actually go to the Free Library of Philadelphia and Xerox these pages from IRS's Statistics of Income, and then input manually the numbers in our it wasn't Excel at that time, it was a company or program called 123. But anyway, we had to do that manually. Now, in this age, you can go on the IRS website and there are literally limitless number of tables, salaries, deductions, charitable contributions by income category, deductions, home mortgage, you name it. The whole thing is right there. You download it and you can actually run your computations yourself. So that was always available, but now the speed with which we can get it is so much greater. And this, and I think as Anu was just mentioning, this isn't just IRS and SOI. This is true of almost every agency, that you can download all kinds of tables and write some pretty good stories as a result.
Thanks, Jim. I think, should we move on to the Q&A section?
I think so.
Okay. One of the first questions here is from Drew Adamek, and he asks, what's your strategy for focusing on the main story and not wandering off towards interesting but irrelevant tidbits in the document? That's one part of it. And the second part is, how often do you call in outside experts to interpret documents? What's your standard for when you need outside help?
On the former question, I think that's the heart of a lot of journalism, I think. And this is why so many editors sometimes get worried about projects, because they've all had some very promising reporter who wandered into a cave and kept finding this offshoot and that offshoot. And pretty soon the poor guy was never seen again. And because when you start getting deeply into every subject, we all know how much more interesting it becomes. What I've always tried to do is once I've isolated issues, I've tried to follow that issue out. And then even at the end of that, write it. Maybe not even knowing where it's going to be in the story or in the series, but knowing that it was an interesting topic that was worth pursuing. And then once that was done, then moving on to the next one. Basically, in other words, not thinking about the whole, but thinking about what's right in front of you if you believe that that's interesting. Could be a personality, it might be a program, it might be one incident that you ran across of somebody who'd been abused economically, financially, or personally, whatever the situation is, just write that. Also, because almost everything has to be rewritten anyway, so you might as well get it out. It helps you form your thoughts about that issue. It helps you see how much more you need or don't need. So I'm a great believer in writing as you go along, which is one of the biggest changes on my part from when I was a lot younger reporter. So, and in terms of experts, it depends on the subject. Sometimes when we read something or find something that seems controversial, Don and I knew tax lawyers over the years who we might talk to off the record, run things by them just to see if their interpretation was anywhere near ours. The same thing was true when the Hughes book, what we did years ago. I remember talking to a number of doctors about issues of drug overdoses at the time, which were much less common than, of course, they are now, about what comprised it. And because Hughes died with a huge amount of codeine in his body. And we asked a number of doctors, is this, some studies indicate this is a potentially fatal amount. What do you think? So we only did it usually when we had tried to perform some analysis on our own beforehand. And it was just kind of a backup to see, are we here? Is this good? Are we off in left field here? So it was an ad hoc, it depended on the story, but we almost always, when something was controversial, extremely in that area, we would try to find somebody to run it by.
Our next question we can take is, could you give some advice on what to do if you're not sure how or where to find a document? And do you call sources who can point you in the right direction, for example? What other ways would you look at it?
Any and all. If you've done everything you can think of, if you think something exists, call source. I'll never forget quickly. We were once trying to run down some foreign military sales, and excuse me, somebody had told us that this was an agency within the State Department. And I'll never forget talking to somebody in the State Department and said, no, we don't have those. Those are, that's the Department of Commerce. So I remember talking to the Department of Commerce and no, we don't have those. Finally, I went to a study group outside Washington that studied government spending, particularly in the military. And he said, no, this is a State Department office. And they said, it's actually in room 6220 or whatever it was, of Maine State. So I went back to the PR guy at State and I said, no, you really do have them go to room 6220. So yes, you sometimes do have to call people outside if you run into every roadblock. And there are an awful lot of nonprofits that do study various aspects of government, both at the national and certainly local and regional level. But generally, it's something you just have to think of on your own. You have to think, what is the possibility of one particular thing? And sometimes it involves a series of calls like that before you run it down.
So I'm going to combine two questions here. One is, can you talk about, reporters are constantly juggling different things, beat reporting, and then investigations also. How do you balance that? And in the same way, if you have a story and you've done interviews 5 years ago and that's gone on the back burner, but you want to bring it to life again, how would you do that with, say, for example, data?
Let me see, let's talk about juggling first. I think most of us probably, if we had our druthers, would love to focus on one thing, see it out and get it done. But of course, sometimes that isn't happening. And I remember all my early years in journalism in Kansas City. I was almost always doing multiple things because there was just no choice. And I understand that. And that's what sometimes you have to do. I guess the best advice for it is to try to, if you're having to juggle, to at least try to stick with one as much as you can, to at least finish a part of it in your head, in the reporting anyway, before you have to move on. It obviously saves you then having to go back and restart the process. I suppose that's kind of self-evident, but I think as much as you can do that, the fewer things you juggle, obviously you're going to be better off. In terms of going back to things, I guess it maybe I'm not sure I can answer that one. I suppose it's a matter of seeing what's happened to that particular issue, obviously, in the 5 years or so that have passed since that particular thing arose. The one thing that I learned over time is that the process of change in terms of information that's available is, of course, constantly changing. I've been surprised over the years. Some agencies have been very, very receptive with Freedom of Information Act requests, others not so much. And then over time, it would change. One that had been good became bad, one that was bad was suddenly good. Mainly it was because of whoever had taken over that particular office. So anytime you go back, I think you have to assume there's probably been a lot of changes in that whole situation. But that doesn't mean that whatever you reported on, whatever you had filed away, isn't still going to be good for you. It's just a matter, obviously, of checking to make sure it's still valid.
Our next question is, lately we've been running into situations where records requests are answered with letters that say that the record retention policy doesn't require the state agency to keep them that far back, and therefore they no longer exist. Have you had this happen, and how do you work around them?
I've not had that happen, but I've known some fellow journalists that has happened to, and I guess the only way, your only salvation there is that if you might be able to find if there had been any litigation around the issue, then it might be a matter of finding a law firm that had been associated with that. Sometimes, and one thing I didn't mention about court records is that sometimes in big cases, the law firm that is maybe litigating a case will sometimes open their files to you, and it saves journalists some of the process of going through the actual agencies themselves, and opens up depositions, declarations, all kinds of things like that that can make the whole process much faster. So I think that would be the first thing I would do. If the records aren't there, I would try to find out, was there any litigation around this agency or this person or whatever in the past, and then go to that law firm. I found over the years, many, many lawyers are very happy to share that kind of stuff with you because they were very, proud of the work they did, or they felt their client had a legitimate beef. That's would be the first thing. Other than that, if the records are destroyed, I'm not sure what other recourse you'd have other than trying to find them in a private place of that sort. Was there a second part of that question too? I can't.
No, I think that was it.
Okay.
Our next question is there a different approach to the documents of a story that's historical in nature, say from the 1940s or 30s? I understand that the same basic documents probably apply, but is there anything else to consider?
I don't think so. I think it depends on the agency. I mean, documents don't obviously tell everything, but they are certainly a very important piece of the puzzle. I mean, if you think of the 40s, sometimes I think people maybe wrote down things in more detail than they do now. One of the most dramatic things from the 40s that to me speaks well about what documents can be. I don't know if any of you have ever read William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Even though this came out in 1959, well before a gazillion other books about Nazi Germany have come out, it's still a great great work. And it was the first massive work that really documented what Germany had been like in the late 30s and 40s. And this has to do with documents. Scherer was in Germany in the 30s. And he said in doing the book and in looking at everything, he was surprised at how often his memory differed from the documents he came across as to what was happening in Germany. He said every time that happened, he went with the document because human memory is usually much more fragile than that. So they're not perfect, but they're really the best, I think, the best thing we have in many cases. And in my viewing of stuff, and Don and I once did a huge series on radioactive waste disposal. You notice he and I have done these lighthearted topics over the years. I guess you've all noticed what we've done. But anyway, we looked at radioactive waste, not whether nuclear power is good, bad, or anything like that. We have this stuff. What are we going to do with it? Simple as that. And an awful lot of the research dealt with the 40s and the 50s about what people thought would happen. And there were some misconceptions, but they weren't lies, outright lies. They were just misconceptions about what people thought should be done, but honestly and directly expressed. So I think in some ways the stuff from the past, there was more detail. There was more rich detail because people spent a little more time, I think, going into that. So, but I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with using that material.
Another question we have is, do you have any guidelines to suggest in regard to using anonymous sources, and under what circumstances would you use them?
Great question. We have generally, we're not averse to anonymous sources by any means, and we have used them many times over the, I should say we talked to them many times over the years. What we've tried to do in most cases was find some other way to, once they reveal something, to find some other way to get that information on the record. So we have, just as a general policy, tried to use as few as possible. There have been exceptions here and there. And in the story on the airlift of the billions of dollars to Iraq that I mentioned earlier, one of the interviews was with a fellow who was in Iraq at a kind of a mid-level management position. And once the money got over there and went into a safe in Saddam Hussein's former palace, US authorities used the cash to actually pay government contractors. And he said he was amazed one day when somebody came in and the cash was like in a wheelbarrow, like garden implements or something like that. And I said, well, who brought it up? And he said, well, it was a young military man from blah, 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 so forth. Do you remember his name? Yes, he remembered his name. So I wanted to find this guy and just talk to him about that process. I finally found him. By then he had been stationed in Guam or somewhere like that. And he confirmed this, told me some more about it. At the time he was still in the military. And I made a decision on my own. I was not going to use his name because that seemed to me to be unnecessarily jeopardize him and maybe his career and so forth. I felt like the information was very accurate at that point because the other guy who was on the record attested this. He just hadn't actually gotten it out of the safe. So I think everybody has to look at those, make those decisions for themselves. I think the less you use anonymous, I should say the less you quote anonymous, the better off you're going to be. Readers have more faith in what you're doing, but every once in a while it has to be done. And like I said, whenever we got information from one, we would try to find some other way to verify that, if not all of it, at least part of it.
We're almost out of time, but Jim, do you want to wrap it up and summarize and give a few parting tips, perhaps?
Well, I think, first of all, it's been a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm sorry we all aren't in a room somewhere where we could do this. I guess that's true of all of us at this point, right? But I think the only thing I would say is documents, records seem very daunting to people, but really they're the key to understanding a lot of the way government, politics, or society works. Don't be intimidated by the numbers. Don't even be intimidated by some of the jargon you find in some documents. The trick very often I have found is to read and reread things. People ask me, how do you keep track of stuff? And the way I do it mainly is by going back and rereading something I've already found. It may be the transcript of an interview. It may be a report. Because what I found often with documents and records in general, no matter how much you're focused on something and you read it, and you're in your research, you're going to come up with other information that's going to make something in that first thing you read important that wasn't apparent to you the first time around. So rereading is an absolute crucial thing with records. And the second thing I would say, which again, I think I alluded to this, when I was younger, I would work on a story and I would save up everything until the end, and I would have this pile of stuff there and I would sit down and write it. At some point, Don and I realized this is a crazy way to do things, especially if you're doing a big story. Write things as you go along. When you see something, when you're dealing with a person, an issue, a subject, a program, and you think for sure that's going to be part of your story, whether it's one story or series, just write it. You're going to need to rewrite it anyway. So that's one thing I strongly urge. And then the last thing I would say, which is not just has to do with documents, has to do with the reporting in general. The first rule I learned as a wet behind the ears young reporter in Kansas City was to never assume. You never assume how somebody's name is spelled. Never assume the name of the company, where they work, how that's spelled. Never assume where you will find the document. Never assume who will or will not talk to you. Never assume has been the first rule I learned in this business a few years back. And it's the rule I continue to learn and relearn every week I do any of this work. So that's also one of the things on the little tip sheet we'll send out later. But so whether you're doing documents, short stories or long stories, never even assume that you really know what that subject is about. Be prepared to change your mind, be prepared to alter what your perception was. So anyway, that's my modest amount of information.
Jim Steele, I thank you. And Anu Narayan Swamy of the Washington Post, I'll tell you, if the private emails and texts that I've been getting during this hour from some of the folks attending are any indication, this is going to be watched and rewatched by folks who I think have learned a great deal. And we want to thank Jim and Anu both for sharing this hour, but also for their leadership on the board of directors at the Fund for Investigative Journalism. As we've mentioned, we will send out to everyone who registered for this session, you'll get a recording of the session, the tip sheet that Jim mentioned, and the slides that Anu and Jim used as they walked us through this. You can also go to our website, fij.org, to see past seminars and webinars, and also to learn how to apply for grants and get other help from the fund. Jim Steele, Anu Narayan Swamy, thank you so much for leading us through this hour, and thank all of you for attending and sharing the hour with us. Have a great day.
Great to be with everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.